Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Palmer as our speaker today. Dr. David Palmer earned his BSc and his PhD in chemistry from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dave has been a faculty member in chemistry at the University of Saskatchewan since 1999 and has served as head of that department for 9 years. He has served as chair of the Biological and Medicinal Chemistry Division of the Canadian Society for Chemistry from 2005 to 2006, and is a co-founder of the Western Canadian Medicinal Chemistry Workshop. He has been a member of the NSERC Discovery Evaluation Group for chemistry since 2008, and is co-chair for organic and bioorganic chemistry for the 2020 and 2021 competitions. His research interests are in organic chemistry and enzymology, especially with enzyme structure-function relationships, inhibitor design, chemoenzymatic synthesis, carbohydrates, and inositols. Today's presentation and discussion is intended for trainees who have little to no experience in writing a grant and will be based upon his experience on the NSERC Discovery Evaluation Group. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Palmer.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan, and I will share my screen here. I am coming to you from my home in Saskatoon, which is in Treaty 6 territory and is the traditional homeland of the Métis. I agreed to do this in part because in recent years, when I've talked to a lot of young scientists, I do hear a recurring theme about how one of the biggest barriers they feel is a lack of confidence, or if you like, the imposter syndrome that you hear about a lot. And maybe a concern that they don't have what it takes, or they don't belong in this, or they don't know how they're going to proceed in this field. And of course, that's a normal thing to feel. That goes away with experience, but when you're starting out, there's no way to get experience. So I really felt like one of the things that I can do for young scientists is just provide them with information so that the knowledge that they have about how things work can empower them so that they can move forward with their career effectively. So, acknowledging that this is a presentation and everyone is busy and has lots of things to do, and if you get bored and leave, I thought I would start out by just telling you what the key points that I'm going to bring out are. Number one, when applying for a grant, and this might sound silly to you, but read the instructions. And as someone who evaluates grants, I can tell you there are a lot of people who don't. And this is really important because it can kill an otherwise perfect grant. Know your audience. That is, know who you're writing your grant to, because that is an important aspect of how you're going to write it. And because I just cannot emphasize this enough, seriously, read the instructions. It's extremely important. Okay, so what do I know about grants? I think is a good question that anyone can ask, including myself. Well, I agreed to do this because, of course, I have written or co-written many grants, and on the side of the screen there is just a list of all of the funding agencies that I'm aware of that have provided me with funds over the years. But I've read a lot more. As a colleague, as a mentor, as a department head, and as an external referee. And as pointed out in the introduction, I've served on the selection committees, not just for NSERC, but certainly for NSERC. But I will say that my main experience and my main expertise is talking about NSERC discovery grants. And so most of my primary examples throughout this is going to be about NSERC discovery grants, but I'm really using that as an example, and I hope that the principles can apply to most any kind of grant that you might be looking for. But certainly there'll be a lot of time at the end for discussion about that, which I hope we can engage in. So, you're going to write a grant and we'll just accept right up front that you have great ideas, you've got the skills, the drive, the experience, you have everything it takes to do some terrific research. So the thing that you have to understand, and what a way I think about it, is that your ideas are kind of like your children. These are my children. And as you can see, they are the most adorable creatures that you'll ever see in your entire life. The point that I'm trying to make here is that nobody feels about your children the way that you do. And so if you're going to write a grant that amounts to a tremendous epic poem to how much you are in love with the idea, this is not an effective approach to grant writing. This is why I say know your audience. That is, you are not writing this for you. You have a goal in mind when you write a grant, and that goal is that it will be successful so that you can get money, so that you can do science, so that you can perhaps make the world a better place. That's what this business really is all about, or at least it should be. So in knowing your audience, you have to ask yourself, who will read it? And what is their expertise? And what specifically are they looking for when they read a grant? Because they won't be reading your grant in isolation. They'll be reading others. So just as an example of who will read it, here is this past year's roster for NSERC Evaluation Group 1504, which evaluates all grants in the country, discovery grants in the field of chemistry. So there is a group chair and there's a program officer, and then there are 22 members who read the grants. Most of them read more than 40 grants for one competition. They receive them around Christmas, and then they meet on usually Super Bowl Sunday, first Sunday in February, and then spend all day, every day for 4 days discussing all of these grants. There are, of course, specific criteria to be assessed, and that allows for normalization and fairness, but you have to kind of think of this kind of process when you think that's what your grant is going to and how it will be read. So your goal is don't make it hard for them. You want them to be able to read your grant and get your point without hunting and searching and scratching their heads. Okay, so there are many types of grants. There are operating grants, which I think are what people tend to think of normally when they think of a grant that they're going to apply for. So what does an operating grant do? It pays for salaries, it pays for reagents, disposables, computers, all of the small stuff, all of the day-to-day things, which, as the name implies, you use to operate your research program. There are equipment grants. An example of that would be the NSERC Research Tools and Instruments program, which funds any kind of instrument between $7,000 and $150,000. Now, there are also larger grants. Those are the kinds of grants you would apply for if you're buying an NMR for your department, or if you're funding the synchrotron, which is another type of grant altogether. There are partnership grants. That's with a private company where the company puts in money, the granting agency puts in money, and there is obviously a focused goal in mind there. And then there are scholarships and fellowships, which are something that, of course, the trainee might be interested in, a little bit different there, but a lot of the same principles apply in terms of, especially if you have a research proposal to write for it. So I'm going to spend most of my time really talking about operating grants today. And some of the questions that you can have about an operating grant that will differentiate the types is, are you applying for funding that will fund a program or a project? And I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two things. And are you applying for something that has a broad focus or a narrow focus? And A broad focus would be, again, you're going to apply for research to fund your program in organic chemistry versus, let's say, a recent call for research on COVID-19, which clearly has a specific focus in mind. So these different types of things all are available and have to be thought about. So how is a grant evaluated? This is clearly important. Most every grant will have something like these first two categories. They may not call them this exactly. This is the phraseology from NSERC. But they will assess the excellence of the researcher, that is your past performance. They will assess the merit of the proposal, that is the ideas, the choice of the problem, the originality, the innovation, the feasibility, etc. And then some grants will have a varying focus or an emphasis on training. Some will not at all. With NSERC, for example, there is a heavy emphasis on training in what they call highly qualified personnel. And then you would be assessed on any past training experience you have and the outcomes of your trainees, a training plan that you would propose, and what's known as equity, diversity, and inclusion plans. And I will talk more about that later as well. Some grants don't emphasize that as much, but they do emphasize something like the relevance of your research to Canada or to your province or to your area. And this is more of an economic impact that might be an outcome of your research. Most grants will have some variation of how are you going to train them, but not all. There are different models of evaluation. For example, the one I think you think of the most would be peer review. And that is a panel of experts looking at your grant and assessing its value. An alternative would be a panel of scientists who are not experts specifically to your field. There is something called a conference model. What that means is if you are working in an interdisciplinary area, and if you're a member of GlycoNet, then that's very likely to be the case. You're looking at molecules that are going to impact the life sciences. So you may have a dilemma with respect to, am I applying to a chemistry committee? Am I applying to a biological sciences committee? A conference model means you can apply to a chemistry committee, but if it's interdisciplinary, they will bring in someone from an adjacent committee, a cognate committee like a biological sciences committee, to also review your grant. This should help with funding interdisciplinary work. That's the goal anyway. There is another way to evaluate grants, and that's evaluation by end users. It's a good way to categorize it. So for example, if you are applying for health research, it may well be that clinicians are asked to evaluate your proposal because the outcomes affect the clinic. On the other hand, perhaps your work in immunology is going to impact pig farming, or your work in proteins is going to affect crops. So you're going to be applying to an agricultural funding body, and some of those evaluators will be what are known as producers. You might think of them as farmers. And of course, their interest in your research is going to be a lot different from a scientist. That is, they're very interested in short-term outcomes. There's also, especially again, if you're working in the health field, members of the community, including patients, who will be advocates for the treatment of their conditions, and they will evaluate your research. And if that's the case, you really need a different approach or a different pitch in order to make sure that their research, your research, is meaningful to them. Okay, so I mentioned scientists, but not experts. And again, I'll turn to this NSERC evaluation group as an example. And I'll kind of ask you, for example, most of you, I think, will be carbohydrate chemists. So if I asked you, name me just the very best carbohydrate chemists in the country, the top experts. If any of you said, well, Dave Palmer, well, God bless you. But the truth is, I'm pretty far down the list of carbohydrate experts in Canada. But if you take a casual look down the list of people on the chemistry evaluation group, what you'll find is that I am the expert in carbohydrate chemistry in this group. And that gives you an indication of how, while I am certainly have a lot of knowledge with respect to carbohydrate chemistry, I may not have a clear understanding of maybe your impact on immunology or the details of your glycan research. But I'm going to be the one who is probably going to be the primary reviewer of your grant. So in the general case, each grant is evaluated by 5 members of this committee. So even for something as general as an organic chemist, an organic chemistry grant, you can count on 2 to 3 organic chemistry readers, maybe more, but maybe not. So the other readers are going to be a physical chemist or an analytical chemist or an inorganic chemist, etc. Somebody whose expertise is primarily in mass spec may be the 5th reader on a synthetic chemistry grant. So how is that dealt with? Well, the experts are the external reviews, which are solicited by the committee. So that's where your top expert, the person who knows all about your research almost as much as you do, is going to be asked for their opinion, and then that review is then evaluated by the EG members. So that's an important thing to kind of think about in terms of just how exactly your grant will be read. So how do they manage it? Well, they do this by, for most grants, granting agencies, and my specific example is from NSERC, they use something called merit indicators, or the criteria. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this entire grid of verbiage, but the point I would make here is that these criteria, which you can see that there are 3 categories and there are 6 possible scores in each of these categories, these criteria are publicly available. So there is absolutely no reason that you, when writing the grant, cannot use this as the means to try and pitch your grant to score effectively. So for this, if you Google NSERC merit indicators, it will take you directly to this figure. And I can tell you when grants come to NSERC and they are evaluated, this grid is printed out on an 11 by 17 page and laminated and sitting in front of every evaluation group member. And for every grant, you're asked to refer to this grid in why you are choosing the score. So I'll go through this a little bit more detail as we go along. Starting with the excellence of the researcher. So there are those 6 possible scores in this category. And what I want to draw your attention to is it doesn't mention how many papers has this person published. And there is no mention of journal impact factor or H index, if you know what that is. What it invites the evaluators to do is assess the excellence, the accomplishments, the impact themselves, and decide if it is the highest quality or exceptional, or if it's below an acceptable level or insufficient. Now, your CV, to a great extent, will speak for itself. And we can all read it, and there is only so much spin you can give to your past accomplishments. But for every grant that I've encountered, you do have the opportunity to describe your contributions. And so that is your opportunity to bring out why a particular piece of work is impactful, or bring out what is the excellence that's involved there. And that can be a single publication or an entire area that you've worked on in the past. I also want to point out that for each of these categories, it includes something called your service. What does that mean? Well, service here refers to your service to the scientific community. Good examples of that were perhaps you were the president of a society, or perhaps you were the associate editor of a journal in your area. These are things that are you making contributions to the field that strengthen the entire field. Much like, and serving as an evaluation group committee member is another good example. And all of these things are things that you do for free on top of your full-time job, because it's important that the community support each other. And so that is a factor in evaluating these things. The proposal summary. Now, in my invitation to attend this, I suggested that if you wanted to, you could try and write a proposal summary for a grant that you had in mind. And what I invited you to do was write a 500-word summary intended for an expert audience, and then a 250-word summary intended for a non-expert audience. And I did that really as a formative process, in other words, to kind of show you, number one, how difficult it is to just take something that's 500 words and take it down to 250 words. But that is an important skill that you will need to develop as a scientist. And also to emphasize the difference between writing to an expert and writing to a non-expert. So if you are working in the area of glycans, well, the average person that you meet on the street does not know what a glycan is. So you're going to need to define that for them. And remember, you only have 250 words to describe your program. So this is something that does take practice. What I have here in the slide is a summary. Can be like an abstract for an article, but it serves a slightly different purpose. So over here, I have a suggested abstract or summary paragraph for an article that Nature promotes for their journals. And this is a very nice little figure that gives you an idea of how to construct an abstract. But you really are aiming this at an expert audience, or specifically someone who is interested in your area of research and this publication in particular. So that purpose is not really the purpose of a proposal summary. A proposal summary, what will it get used for? Well, it's very often used to select the reviewers that will read that proposal in the first place. So you have to think carefully about that, because you can steer who reviews your grant in this way. And you certainly do not want the wrong people reviewing your grant, because if they don't get what you're trying to do, then that's not going to be a successful strategy. It can be used to select the external reviewers who will be the experts. And it's often encouraged to be in plain language, as I just talked about. I would say, and I always say, treat the summary seriously. It's often not included specifically in the score of your grant, but it is your opportunity for your first impression. As I said, will often determine who's reading it in the first place. It's going to establish your ability to communicate your science. And so again, that's an impression you're making on the reviewers, but it's also really good for you in the sense that it makes you reflect on the big picture of what you're trying to do. And this is something that, again, takes practice. It is very easy for a scientist to get caught up in the fine details of what they're doing And if you get too caught up in that, then you forget to make anyone else interested in what you're doing. So I would say, you know, you write this summary first, but then you revisit that summary throughout the grant writing process, and it can affect the way you write the grant, and the way you write the grant can then in turn affect the summary back again, because this should be an iterative process where you're thinking about the science and where it's going. So here is the NSERC summary instructions, and you can see that they are short. Use simple terms, briefly describe the nature of the work to be done, indicate why and to whom the research is important, the anticipated outcomes and the benefits to the research field and to Canada. So not a lot of specifics there, but this is their way of saying, tell us why someone should fund your work. And that's always a good thing to keep in mind. It's not just because your work is beautiful. There needs to be more of a reason than that. Okay. The proposal tends to be the meat of all this, and it's to some extent why we're here. And again, we'll start off with what is the mandate of the agency in the program. And this should have a deep impact on what you write. So a great example of this is NSERC Discovery does not fund health research. A lot of people don't know this, but that is the truth. The NSERC Discovery Program, which is the main funding program for all the research in the natural sciences and engineering across the country, does not fund health research. And that was a decision of Parliament. Changing that would take an act of Parliament. So when the tri-council agencies are created, CIHR, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, they fund health research. And you cannot get health research funded by NSERC. It also is committed to funding research programs and not projects. So what does that mean to you when writing? It means one of the things you have to keep in mind is I'm writing something that is going to have outcomes 15 years down the line, 25 years down the line, not something that is I'm going to be done and complete and have a nice story 5 years from now, and then I'll move on to something else. And to some extent, of course, you do have to think in terms of what am I going to do in the next 5 years? Because of course your research brings up new questions all the time. So it is a little bit of a balancing act. But the key is you must convince the evaluation group, you must convince the agency that what you're writing is not a health project and is not a project at all, that it's a program. Because if you don't, that is considered a fatal flaw and you get nothing. There is no in between. There is either this falls into the mandate and we'll fund it to some extent, or you get no money at all. On the other hand, let's say, and I've invented this imaginary granting agency, let's say you're applying to the Nunavut Health Initiative. Well, that's quite a different thing. And among other things, it's much more likely to be a project. It's certainly going to be about health. And as I advise, you try and have the words Nunavut and health in the first sentence, if possible, because you have to hook the evaluators right away that this grant is something that is worth funding and worth continuing on. Okay, the first thing I told you off the top was read the instructions. And again, this is really important. And I have here the complete instructions for writing an NSERC Discovery Grant proposal. They are brief and to the point. But I'll tell you right off the top, look at the first one, limit of 5 pages. So a reminder, I just told you that your proposal should give people the impression that you're thinking way down the road of an entire research program. But you only have 5 pages to do all of the things that are listed below here. And they mean it by 5 pages in the sense that if there are more than 5 pages, they just remove everything after that. That includes figures, by the way. So you have lots of freedom to write the grant you want, but there are specific things that the granting agency is looking for. And again, I'll remind you that the person reading this has 45 of these to read. Use the headings. If this is what you're asked to include, why would you make someone look around for those things? Now, I have seen discovery grants or other grants written in many different ways and many different formats, but the good ones always use these headings, whether they're in this order or whether they're in a part 1 and a part 2 with these headings in part 1 and these headings in part 2. It doesn't matter. If you're really not sure how you're going to go about this, then of course the best way is to ask your colleague or you ask your mentor for recent successful examples, because that will immediately show you that there is more than one way to write this and still hit all of these notes. Many institutions will have a repository, for lack of a better term, of successful grants that they can make available to you. So there'll be someone in your research office that you can contact who will say, this is how you should go about doing this. Again, look at the evaluation criteria. They're available. There is no excuse for writing this without those criteria in mind. So what are the NSERC criteria? Again, there are 6 scores within this category. What are they asking? Is the research clear, original, and innovative? The long-term and short-term goals clearly described? Is the methodology clear and appropriate? The funds are clearly needed? In other words, is this work not funded already by something else, which double dipping is definitely discouraged. And the boldface that I've used here brings out something clear, which is they're looking for whether or not you're being clear. And that can seem kind of a vague term. So how do you know that you are being clear? Well, again, in order to be clear, you put those objectives up front, either literally, they're the first thing in your grant, or literally make them bold, or both, and you refer back to them for each experiment or a project that you're proposing, so that it's clear that these objectives are what you're after. Now, if this is a long grant, a CIHR grant, an NIH grant, these can be 10 to 25 pages long, some are longer, then you need to revisit these objectives regularly. And the fact, what I advise people is it should seem repetitive to you, because what seems repetitive to you is going to be new to someone who's reading this for the first time. And again, if they're on grant number 30 and they're on page 22, they want to be reminded, why are you doing this experiment again? And so keeping those objectives there and revisiting them as much as possible is going to make that point for them. Make the figures large enough to read. Again, it's Christmas Eve, you're reading grant number 30, you come across this, you're not going to be happy, and you're not going to be spending a lot of time squinting to try and figure out what point you're getting across. And I do see this a lot of the time, and it's not worth it. It is self-defeating to try and squeeze things in and hope that someone will try and read it. So I like to say, avoid excess TLAs. Does everybody know what a TLA is? That's a 3-letter acronym. So it's easy to fall into this trap. It's a strategy for saving space, by not using large words. You use these acronyms, but again, if you're on page 4 of 5 and you're trying to remember what is a PXG and how is it different from the PXL and the PXA, then it's going to make the grant seem not very clear to you. So you should minimize their use, you should define them clearly. And if you do find that you're in a field or in a project where these things are necessary, what I have seen people do is create a footer at the bottom of every page that defines the key acronyms. So you will give up a line of text on each page to do this, but if it's that important to use these acronyms, then you can make it easy for your reader to know what they are, to just refer to them. Okay, I said hit the notes before, and this is what I mean. Hit the notes that in terms of the musical notes, they're going to resonate with the reader. One of the things you need to do is remind the reader that you have the skills and the resources to do the work that you're talking about. You cannot rely on your CV for that. You have to make sure that they're not asking, does he have a ICP-MS at that institution? Say it. Also, you need to point out the novelty of what you're doing. Don't assume that they will see that this is new. You can't assume that they get the point. You need to make that point. Okay, some generic writing tips for writing any kind of grant or even an article and a proposal in many cases, a report. Technique I like to use is reverse outlining. You write a first draft and then you take the first sentence of each paragraph and you look at those and you ask, does this look like the outline that you want? Does that series of sentences tell the story that you're trying to tell? And this can really surprise you once you've done it. Another one is the judicious use of color. Almost everybody will be reading your grant on a computer screen, so there's not too much to worry about color, although be mindful of color blindness. And there are resources on good choices of color schemes for colorblind people. But you can use color, for example, to differentiate sections. What I mean by that is here on the slide, I have a purple section and a green section because those two things are really unrelated sections. But you can also match an objective to a figure. So the reader will just mentally in their mind associate this green box with the green lettering over here. But of course, be careful, don't use too much. You'll end up looking like some sort of carnival and it will become distracting the way typos and spelling mistakes are distracting and will take the reader out of the story, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to do. Use what can be called assertive language. Don't be vague. Don't look at a problem. Your goal here is to define something, measure, determine, or quantify, or to answer a question, not to observe. Try to avoid words that don't really sound like you think you're going to be successful. Don't say this might result in, or we hope to. Say we will do this as much as possible. And of course, this might seem obvious, but don't lie in a grant proposal thinking, well, no one will ever know it's just a grant proposal. This is academic misconduct. This can result in you not getting a grant. This can result in you being barred by the granting agency from ever getting a grant. This can result in you being fired from your position. This is very serious. Okay, the hard part, honestly, you need to write for the expert and the non-expert. And there is no short and clever way to tell you how to do this. It takes practice, and the best way to try and get at this is to get other people to read your grant. And this is absolutely essential. Then read the proposal, but read all parts of the grant and get their feedback. So If you were, for example, in a lab, then I would say, get a lab colleague who knows your work very well. Get a friend from outside of your lab to read it also. So somebody maybe in your discipline, but not really familiar with your work. And then if you can, get someone from outside of your discipline. Now, this might sound strange to you, but I can tell you that my partner is a microbiologist. And of course, I'm an organic chemist. I read her discovery grant proposals. She reads mine. And it's very helpful in terms of, are you being clear? That's a universal concept. Ideally, you get someone who has been funded by this particular agency to read your grant. And although it might seem obvious, you have to listen to their feedback, because it's easy to fall in love with what you've written and not take the advice. But you should take the advice, because your words have to land with other people. That's the goal. Okay, so the budget, the importance of the budget with respect to a grant can vary widely depending on the agency and the program. For some, you apply for this much money, and if you're successful, that's what you get, or you don't get anything. Other programs, the budget is more like an indicator that you understand the cost of research. It's a good indicator that you know what you're doing and what you're talking about. But the score that your grant gets actually determines the dollar value of your grant, regardless of how much you asked for, although rarely do you get more than you asked for. So be careful about that. And of course, there are gradations in between these two extremes. Highly qualified personnel. Well, with NSERC, this is an important thing, and I would say that looking at the criteria, they ask about your research training environment. Do trainees publish? Do they win awards? Do they go to conferences? And this is something that you should think about while you're being a mentor. Are there modern appropriate facilities for the trainees? Are there opportunities for collaboration? Are there opportunities for professional development? Do your HQP, that is, your trainees move on to positions that require skills from your training? That is, does your undergrad go on to a PhD? Does your PhD go on to a postdoc? Does your postdoc go on to be a faculty position, or do they go on to industry? Or do they become a doctor or a pharmacist? These are things that, or even a teacher, things that will require skills from your training. You have a limited amount of control over that, but this will certainly be an indicator of what kind of program you are running. Your training philosophy and plan are appropriate. Your philosophy really has to come from you, but again, having someone else read it can give you a good indication of whether your philosophy is appropriate. And then there's equity, diversity, and inclusion. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I always say, with respect to HQP, you should bring a certain attitude to writing it. And that is, if you consider yourself, your expertise, your record, your resources, and you picture there's you, and maybe you're in a carbohydrate chemistry at this fictional University of Western Alberta. And then I want you to picture someone else who's a lot like you, doing similar work at a similar institution. And then I want to ask yourself, why should someone work for you and not for them? Even better, if you were working with an undergrad and you thought that undergrad was terrific and they're going to go off somewhere to do a PhD, why should that PhD go work in your lab and not someone else's lab? And if you can bring that out in your HQP description, your training description, then that's going to be something that I think will come to the evaluators. EDI. So this is equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, this is a relatively new thing, and it is a relatively difficult thing to try and wrap your head around. And I think for the reason that, as many of you know, we've had lots of discussions lately about structural racism or societal barriers to certain groups. And you may think to yourself, you know, I just want to understand the role of fucose. How can I solve society's problems? but that is not really good enough anymore. NSERC in particular, but a lot of research funders feel that if anyone is going to change positively our field, it's going to be us. And so they're asking you, what are you doing about it? So here are the merit indicators from NSERC about equity, diversity, and inclusion. They say, what are the challenges specific to your institution and to your field of research? And then what are the specific actions that you're taking to, and are these clearly defined? So my advice is always, you're telling this to scientists and they are in the same position that you are, and you should tackle this like a scientist. You should define the problem. If your institution has lots of women as undergrads, but none of them are Indigenous people, then that's something that is specific to your institution and you should talk about. If you have lots of women in your PhD program, but no women in your faculty, what are you doing to solve that problem? So you should state your training in the area. Have you taken courses on unconscious bias? Have you learned about these barriers? And use facts and not feelings. And there are resources out there about statistics that you can quote so that you can show that you understand the problem. And then just describe what you're doing to address the problem. Now, this is EDI is a 45-minute seminar in itself. And as it happens, GlycoNet has a member who gives an excellent one. That's Lisa Willis. And I would certainly recommend taking that if you have the opportunity. Okay, so I'm done talking. In summary, again, read the instructions, know your audience, get and act on the feedback that you receive, and then go out and do great things. And if you're successful, congratulations, and that will be a great thing, and I really hope you are. So I'll just finish off here by thanking GlycoNet for the invitation. Always thank my research group who are in general an inspiration for me on all of the things that I do. I want to thank Professor Janet Hill, who is the aforementioned microbiologist and partner that I rely on for a lot of feedback, and has been helpful with this in particular. And of course, all of my mentors and friends, and you for listening. And I wish you all good luck with your endeavors in writing a grant. I'd be very happy to take some questions on this.